I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Colin Rouse. I'm from the University of Kansas, and I've kind of a last-minute volunteer to introduce Luke since no one was assigned to do that. It was a tremendous privilege, though, because Luke Helker is actually one of my former advisees. He graduated from the University of Kansas this past spring. While he was there, along the way, he got a master's of music in musicology, a master of music in percussion, and a doctorate of musical arts in percussion. He's a tremendously diverse scholar, thinker, and musician in a lot of ways. Since graduating and while he was finishing up, he has taken on a position teaching a variety of courses and percussion lessons at Benedictine College in Northeast Kansas, as well as creating a middle school music program at one of the private high schools in Lawrence, Kansas, and a variety of other teaching and performing on the side as well. So with that, Luke Helker with a lecture recital on materials that matter, cultivating a musical tradition with found objects.
just make sure everything is set. All right. Thank you all for being here with me today. I understand there are a lot of other presentations taking place, opportunities to reconnect with friends and colleagues, or frankly, just the chance to take a nap and provide some sort of respite from all the overstimulation that takes place at a conference like this. So again, I thank you all for being here today. I'd also like to extend a very heartfelt thanks to the board, staff, everyone at AMS-SMT for putting on such a truly wonderful and awe-inspiring conference. In addition to the hotel staff for being so accommodating, it's not every day that they get people calling up asking them to store some blocks of ice. So thank you to everyone involved in this presentation. You just heard Breath Contained by Tonya Ko. And the title of this work is, in a sense, a thesis statement for today's talk. As Ko states, the goal of this and other similar works involving bubble wrap are aimed to, quote, release the voice of this mundane object. It is my hope that this lecture recital will reveal to you all the many voices contained within the objects that you see and hear on stage. Admittedly, though, it does seem rather embarrassing to be presenting such a topic among such an enviable cohort of some of our field's brightest minds. I've already seen several truly compelling and thought-provoking presentations, and I hope that this presentation will provide some modicum of insight for you to take home with you. But I confess, too, that you are also witnessing a research project that is still in its infant stages. As Dr. Rouse pointed out, I just graduated from the University of Kansas in May, and so the first time that this presentation was presented was about 6 months ago. And so as I continue to interrogate my argument and expand my research, I hope that presenting this on such a stage as this will provide an opportunity for additional feedback and reflection, and there'll be plenty of time afterwards for a Q&A should people feel the need to exchange in this dialogue. Now, on to the subject of found objects, or junk percussion, or household objects, or any number of other terms that are dispensed interchangeably by composers and performers alike. This became the first obstacle, and indeed one of the driving forces behind this research. Since percussionists have adopted many of these objects in their own instrumentarium, it seems somewhat prudent to at least attempt to establish a more cohesive vernacular around these objects and the manner in which they are employed throughout the repertoire. Percussionists very often reference Stephen Schick's refrain on the German word for percussion being Schlagzeug, which translates to strike stuff. But it is precisely the word stuff that I want to drill down on today. And to do that, I turn to someone who is not a percussionist, not a theorist, or a musicologist, but rather an anthropologist. Daniel Miller is an anthropologist whose main focus is on the study of stuff, or in other words, material cultures and materiality. He's written books on consumption, social media, and the aptly titled 2009 book, Stuff. In the introduction of this book, he proposes a definition for anthropology, which is someone who seeks to demonstrate the consequences of the universal for the particular, and of the particular for the universal by equal devotion to the empathic understanding and encompassment of both. With this book, he demonstrates how clothing and home ownership, among other examples, provide a better understanding of the nature of anthropology and human behavior. I bring this up because it is my goal to better understand the universality of being a percussionist through the particularness of these found objects. Looking at my art through the lens of anthropology has given me a fresh perspective on what we do. For starters, I've come to realize something that I've known deep down, but hadn't quite yet been able to articulate, which is that to me, nearly all of the items that fall under the banner of percussion, traditional and non-traditional alike, can almost all be considered found objects. These instruments have been discovered from other cultures around the world and integrated and appropriated into the Western canon through many forms of global connection and exchange, obviously some being far more heinous than others. The rate at which we've acquired these instruments and incorporated them into our conventional ensembles has happened so quickly and dramatically, seemingly without much regard for their heritage. And as a result, most collegiate-level percussionists are blessed with having shelves replete with a dazzling array of shakers, gongs, and bells. However, the flip side of this, though, is that with all of this at their disposal, the tendency is for students to simply grab whatever is within arm's reach. But what if we pause for a moment, just before we pick up that gong, and ask ourselves, is this the most appropriate object or instrument for this musical example? Or are we guilty of succumbing to Maslow's law, perhaps uncoincidentally titled, the law of the instrument, which states, if the only tool you have is a hammer, you tend to see every problem as a nail. We must remember that the nail in this analogy still has an origin story, as does the hammer. And while the hammer and the nail may be rather mundane in our literal sense, gongs and rattles are not. They are foundational components to ancient rituals and ceremonies performed by people whose names we will never know. This has led me to a fundamental question behind this project. What is the difference between an instrument and an object? Well, I'm kind of biased. I've tipped my hand a little on this, so if my answer isn't sort of obvious, then I don't know what else I can say. But let's try and illustrate this more concretely. Let us turn to the brake drum, this object right here. Let's turn to the brake drum as an example. The brake drum has been found in many, many musical environments. It's been a substitute for an anvil sound in a lot of 20th century repertoire like Aaron Copland's John Henry. It has been featured in many of the early ensemble works for percussion by Lou Harrison, John Cage, and Henry Cowell, to name a few. But it can also be found in the engine room of a steel band. It is a propulsive, rhythmic, and sonic voice that anchors an ensemble that is, not coincidentally, also fashioned out of repurposed materials. Does this mean then that the brake drum has graduated from objecthood and can now be included in the lofty confines of a percussive instrumentarium? I don't think so, but I'm also no longer sure that that was the right question to be asking in the first place. Because framing it in such a way reinforces a hierarchy where instruments like the timpani and the marimba reside up here, where tin cans and brake drums reside down here. And I'm not sure percussionists actually want to live in a world where that is the case. Removing this type of hierarchy, quickly calls to mind the ready-made works of Marcel Duchamp, who insisted that putting a urinal in an art gallery vaulted its status to new artistic heights, and indeed it is a fitting comparison. But lately, I'm drawn to making comparisons between these works and the sculptures of Claes Oldenburg, whose sculptures embody the true spirit and scale of what I want to convey with these pieces. To amplify or enlarge them reveals the minute textures, hidden shapes, and indeed the breath contained within each structure. Another compelling feature of these sculptures is also where they happen to be placed. Take the shuttlecocks scattered through the front lawn of the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City. These are public-facing works, and therefore accessible to anyone without having to enter the museum itself. The same cannot be said for the works of Duchamp. This allows these works to take on new significance and become symbols for a city and its values. The shuttlecocks are for Kansas City, perhaps as what the bean represents for Chicago, or the love sculpture in Philadelphia. Again, coming back to this idea of the particular for the universal and the universal for the particular. And so now that I've provided at least some degree of philosophical motivation for this project, I'd like to share something that's a little more tangible and concrete. So I've been attempting to establish a model to assist in determining how we can catalog these pieces, these objects, knowing that in any given musical situation, the context is likely to change. Originally, I had identified two intersecting spectra, one of which concerns materiality, going from raw to artificial, and the other dealt with this idea of transformation, or to the degree in which an object is transformed during the performance. However, I soon realized that this language was perhaps both too broad and also too subjective. And it forced me to employ more poetic interpretations of what it meant to transform an object in a piece when I was short of any literal transformation. And after all, do we not already transform an object by repurposing it for a musical aim? So I've modified the language around here to what I believe and what I hope is a more objective stance towards the physical and sonic properties of any given object and how that may or may not change through the course of a given piece. I've retained the two spectra, one for materials and one for the sonic properties. But on each end of the spectrum, we go from minimal manipulation to maximal manipulation. And I'll sort of explain a little more what I mean through the context of each piece. And here's what these two spectra look like when they intersect with one another. And the result then is four sort of overlapping categories here. We have from clockwise going from left to right, we have minimal manipulation of material and sound, minimal manipulation of material, maximum manipulation of sound, maximum manipulation of material and sound, and finally, maximum manipulation of material, minimum manipulation of sound. It's a bit wordy, I know, and admittedly, it's not quite an ironclad model. But nevertheless, a model like this provides a malleable visual representation for the way these objects are dispersed throughout the pieces. And so what you see here is the same grid with several plots on it. Each of these plots represents one of the pieces that you'll hear today. Since most of the pieces focus around a singular object, or at least multiple objects from the same family, I've placed singular dots to reflect this. However, in the case of Mark Applebaum's piece that you'll hear later, it would be more beneficial to carry out this same exercise where every object, instead of piece, is given its own dot, its own representation on the graph. This strategy, too, extends to when found objects are found in chamber music or large ensemble pieces as well. So this is just simply sort of a snapshot. But what I do like about this model is the degree of flexibility it offers to whoever is using it. Even when trying to look at everything through an objective lens, these coordinates were determined by me and my own interpretations of the pieces. And any one of you could have the same chart, the same instruments, and still plot your points, your objects, in slightly different locations on the graph. And it helps, you can only really do that once you as the performer develop a relationship with the character and the music of these objects. And so with that, I'd like to segue into the first quadrant, which contains pieces for minimal manipulation of both sonic and material properties. And the piece that I've chosen to represent this is John Cage's Child of Tree. John Cage has already sort of initiated this idea of, found objects being welcome in the concert hall. We all know his stance on all sounds created equal, and so on and so forth. And it's his 1940 living room music that I cite as at least one of the first examples of a piece that's written for all non-conventional objects, which he lists as household objects, things like a door frame or a table, and so on and so forth. But in the case of Child of Tree, there's been a question that's been percolating in my mind for a while now, which is, in 2023, can anyone really perform Child of Tree without invoking some sort of human impact on the environment? The reason why this was stuck in my head was that I've performed works in the past that contain rather overt references to human interference with the natural world. But this piece was composed well before our current understanding of the climate crisis. And so, but at what cost then? If we're taking these objects out of their natural environment and putting them into the concert hall, I'm not sure what that says about being able to admire the sounds on their own terms when taken out of that context. The score for Child of Tree consists of a series of written, or perhaps more accurately scribbled, instructions. The listed materials are, which you see here in front of me, the listed materials are collected based on their relationship to plants and nature. With the exception of the cactus and the seed pod rattle, the performer is free to pick and choose the remaining items. You'll see here that I have some bamboo chimes, some pine cones, twigs, leaves, and some rocks as well. The performer is then instructed to use the I Ching to determine certain parameters of the piece. Cage limits the duration of this piece to 8 minutes, but then relies on the I Ching to help determine other aspects of the piece, such as subsections within that 8 minutes and the number of materials you're allowed to include within each of those subsections. And so while we're on this subject, let us also note how the I Ching, a Chinese text on divination, has also been removed from its original context and repurposed as one of the primary tools for developing Cage's chance procedures. So because of this, I decided to just use a random number generator to establish the necessary parameters for my own performance. Once this has been completed, then the piece itself is really just a structured improvisation, not unlike Tonya Ko's piece as well. And so the reason for including it in this minimal manipulation category is that Cage does never instruct the performer to destroy or manipulate an object in any dramatic fashion. I certainly could choose to do so by snapping a twig or crumbling a leaf into dust, and doing so would certainly reposition its placement on the graph that we saw earlier. You'll notice too that the cactus is amplified. The amplification is not intended to further distort the sounds through any other electronic means. Rather, it's simply a logistical consideration for audiences to be able to hear throughout. And so with that, I'd like to perform for you all now, Child of Tree. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to turn now towards the opposite corner, which would be maximum manipulation of both sonic and material properties. Interestingly enough, this piece is also centered around a naturally recurring material, that of ice. I know everyone's like, oh, there's ice on the table. What's it going to be? What's it going to sound like? Here we go. So this piece is Vivian Fung's The Ice is Talking, written in 2017 for Stephen Schick and Ayun Huang. This piece begins with knives seductively performing figure eights across the blocks of ice as a callback to the composer's youth when she would skate across the frozen ponds in Canada. Throughout the piece, these knives continue to tap and glide their way around the ice, walking a literal knife's edge between the graceful gestures of an ice skater and the capacity for violence that these knives can exert. And indeed, as the piece goes on, my gestures will become increasingly more violent. All of this occurs while the ice is melting in real time, and has been, with the human hand accelerating the process. This, of course, continues to change the tone of the ice, which I hope will be apparent through the amplification. And there is some additional electronic mediation provided by a max patch, though to me it is a little more of an undercurrent, more of a soundscape, and the majority of what you'll hear is coming from the amplified ice. It is perhaps cliche a little bit at this point to suggest that the natural world has a voice or language of its own. We already know that it does, and many people have devoted large portions of their lives to better understanding it. And so I'll dispense with any attempt to mobilize or marshal attention towards this idea and let the ice speak for itself. This is Vivian Fung's The Ice is Talking. Just make sure the pedal works. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for sticking with me. There's a lot going on with this. So the next category is minimal manipulation of the material and maximum manipulation of the sound properties, in which I've positioned both Tonya Koh's piece that you heard earlier and the next piece we'll hear, which is Matthew Bertner's Broken Drum. Some final thoughts on Koh's piece, since I didn't talk about it that much at the beginning. My actions as the performer are not particularly novel, at least not for a percussionist. I tap, sweep, and flutterfinger my way across the terrain while with some of the amplification to reveal some of those textures. And just as this is a stupid story, but I'll tell it anyway. As a quick aside, I sort of test drove some of these pieces with my middle school students just to see how well it would go off with the general audience. But I had a sixth grader who's quite astute and identified that I was sort of attempting at some moments to perform the bubble wrap in a way a pianist might approach playing the keys. It was not something I had indicated, but it was certainly something I had thought. And the fact that she'd been that receptive, I found pretty remarkable. So kids these days. But the actions that I create in this piece, they create essential tension, which I think is what I don't do in that piece, which is pop the bubbles, at least not until the very end, which I guess, I don't know, is that a perfect authentic cadence? I don't know. Some theorists here would be better appropriate to answer that question. And I don't know about you, but when I was a child, whenever there was bubble wrap in the house, we would immediately dance and stomp on it until it had all been deflated, and then discard it. So so I tap instead of stomp, and create a different type of dance, one that I think is as gentle and as protective as the material itself. So turning to Bertner's piece, this piece with the break drum, and I'll give you a forewarning that it's probably the loudest piece. In this piece, I am encouraged to use and explore the unique properties of every surface of the object. The bulk of the piece is centered around a tremolo in the middle opening of the drum, with the placement of my hand to both mute and unmute the sound in a rhythmic fashion. There is a pre-recorded tape that I play along with, and the pre-recorded tape is derived using granular synthesis that further explores and distorts every audible facet of a break drum. That it is playing alongside me is only to create the mere illusion that we are in an active dialogue. And I suppose this, in tandem with the constant muting or suppressing of the object's voice, might suggest some larger theme on our dialogues, or perhaps lack thereof, between industry and nature. Perhaps maybe the rise of electronic vehicles will render objects like brake drums obsolete and force us to find other materials to replace them. It's happened before, after all. The brake drums of the 30s and 40s that were so readily available to Cage and Cowell are far, far more resonant than the brake drums that we use today. And so I won't speak for Matthew, but I look forward and welcome the opportunity to move beyond the brake drum and to modify the conversation with the evolution of new objects as they exist in their own context, and seeing how we can then find new creative ways for repurposing them in a musical sense. But for now, I hope you'll enjoy Matthew Bertner's Broken Drum. We'll conclude with our final category, that of minimal manipulation of sound, maximum manipulation of the materials. And the piece that I've chosen to represent this is Mark Applebaum's 2006 piece, Echolalia. Echolalia contains what Applebaum calls 22 Dadaist rituals, though to my knowledge, the actions performed as a part of this piece are not directly contained with any pre-existing Dada literature. Nevertheless, the absurdity that defined the Dada movement is on full display here. As Applebaum states in the score, quote, these gestures should look familiar, though as if it were some sort of musical convention of an alien species. And there are 4 principal actions governing this piece. 1, combining or attaching, mixing or syncretizing, separating or atomizing, and the last, treating or deforming. But the sonic palette itself is still generated by interacting with these objects in a relatively normal, mundane fashion, at least on their own individual terms. For example, in just a moment, you'll see me interact with a typewriter, some duct tape, a can of spray paint, in a relatively ordinary fashion. The sounds that are generated are not particularly unusual, but as you'll see, the sounds are incidental to the acts of vandalism and destruction that will occur. I have a few final remarks before concluding with this piece, and I'd like to just briefly return to Daniel Miller and his working definition of anthropology, which is someone who seeks to demonstrate the consequences of the universal for the particular, and of the particular for the universal by equal devotion to the empathic understanding and encompassment of both. As I continue to develop my artistic and educational practice, I do so with equal devotion, as highlighted here, to objects and the more traditional instruments in the percussion inventory. I am choosing to, as Stephen Schick suggests, strip away the aristocracy that comes from separating or perhaps overvaluing instruments over objects. With this new perspective, a drum becomes not just a drum, but a container of air. A triangle, simply a bent piece of metal, no more or less sophisticated than a brake drum. This, to me, is the universality of being a percussionist. Here is Echolalia by Mark Applebaum. Thank you. Thank you.
A couple questions. I guess both the Vivian Fung piece and probably who's the other one? Yeah, the brake drum one.
Yeah.
The computer, or was any of that pre-recorded, or was it like some of it sounded like it could have been supplied to you ahead, but some of it seemed like it was interacting with you in real time. So I'm just curious, and there might be different answer for both of those pieces.
Yeah. So the question is the tape parts, the backing tracks for both Matthew Bertner's Broken Drum, which was the break drum piece that I played, and Vivian Fung's The Ice is Talking. For Bertner, they were two separate things. I'm reading with, I can show you this. You're more than welcome to see the score. Some of the notation is traditional, some of it is very much not traditional. But in the case of Matthew Bertner's score, he supplies, the rhythms and then an approximate waveform of what the tape is doing, so that you can sort of align yourself in some way, but it's not time stamped in any way.
Okay, because on that one, which was different than the Vivian piece, there were a lot of interesting polyrhythms that
Yes.
were taking place. And I didn't know if that was an interesting result, or if you had to be so exact to conform with that.
That was just a clever coincidence.
Okay.
Yeah. And then with Fung's piece, so Vivian Fung is using a max patch, and the signal that's coming in from the microphones is providing some additional reverb. But again, that's another situation where it is separate from a backing track. And so there were, you probably heard some of those extra voices and everything. All of that had been pre-programmed.
They weren't your voice? They sounded like they were your voices.
I did speak as well, but then there were other moments where I wasn't speaking, but there were still some voices in the track.
Places where I was hearing voices, it sounded like the exact timbre of your voice, which was what made me think that it had processed your voice.
No.
Okay.
No, that's interesting. No, that you heard that. No, I wasn't, and at least I wasn't consciously trying to mimic the voice in the tape either.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it did.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Any others? Yeah. Do you want to use the mic or?
I can project.
All right.
So I've been to way too many percussion recitals in my life.
You make it seem like that's a bad thing.
And no. Never enough, actually, I'll say.
Thank you.
And like I was thinking, like to watch Ayun play is to watch a dancer.
Yes.
And especially thinking about your questions today and watching you play, like the difference between an object and an instrument is a percussionist, right? None of these things are making sound right now.
Mm-hmm.
You are actually what makes them into instruments.
Yeah.
And so I guess I'm curious about your thoughts on the instrumentality of self and kind of the implications of embodied sound in relation to your project.
It's a great question. It is indeed something that I think about a lot, and as you so astutely and correctly pointed out, none of these objects make a sound until I command it to, which then perhaps speaks to a certain degree of autonomy that the instruments have, or excuse me, that the objects have, but that is not what your question is asking. It's just something I thought of at the moment. It's, to be totally honest, it's not something I've thought too deeply about other than just the sort of the surface level. I am responsible for making the sound and shaping the sound, both based on what is prescribed in the score and my own sort of artistic intention. Did that answer your question? Not entirely, so I apologize. I'd have to think about that more deeply. Yeah, but I'll think about it some more, and maybe I can come back to it.
I have a question also. Thank you very much for all your effort in this fascinating paper.
Yeah.
I'm studying musical instruments, so I was seeing your paper as an organology paper actually, and thinking about where is the difference between the object and the instrument.
Yeah.
In my studies, I try to to consider like classic musical instruments, Western musical instruments as objects, and as objects that have like a function in society and that have maybe more this kind of function that a nail or a hammer or a screwdriver or so might have, but in a different context, in a musical context, but also in society and so on. So I think there's the distinction between the object and the instrument is just like a scholarly distinction or so. So I would like to invite you to our organology study group.
Yeah.
and contribute with your ideas, because I think it's very interesting, because we have to see it from the other way around, you know, from the object perspective. And this I found very fascinating that you came from this side. Yeah.
Thank you for your remarks. I totally agree with everything that you said, and yeah, the sax and hornbossel, a lot of that organology literature was part of the the survey of the research literature, and using that, but also in surveying percussive textbooks, how they take some of that and modify some of that within the sort of a narrower scope. All of that was contributing to my research, but you're also correct to point out that there's a hint of this being more or less just a sort of academic exercise, just an academic mental exercise, which I embrace. Yeah. Yeah. Question?
Yeah, so this question is going to be kind of a short and technical question, but I first want to thank you for providing to us such a sonically rich and thought-provoking presentation. And I feel like this is such a wonderful opportunity, because in academia we don't study music like this often. Maybe a footnote in the music history sequence about John Cage, but that's mainly it. So with that question, speaking of Cage, I wanted to know how, when you were performing with the two stones together, how you were able to manipulate the pitch such that it was higher and lower. Yes.
So, first of all, thank you for your comments. I appreciate the kindness, and yeah, I agree with what you're saying too about the limitations of maybe discussing this in an academic context. I feel like most of us maybe bring up Cage's Water Walk, that video performance, but it ends up more so being a conversation around, does this qualify as music? Right. And perhaps less so about the instrumentation itself and the musical qualities that come from that. But to answer your question with the stones, this is a trick that I learned while doing George Crumb's Music for a Summer Evening. In the fourth movement, he calls for prayer stones, but he organizes it in either ascending or descending melodies. So if you're in a pinch and you don't have 5 prayer stones at your disposal, what you can do is you can squeeze the stone itself and then open up your hand, and by doing that, you can kind of modulate the pitch, so to speak. And so that's what I was doing. I was simply just loosening or tightening my grip on the rock while I was doing that.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Of course, thank you. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, these performances are really engaging. I'm also in the organology group, so we'd love to connect. But I had a question about the instruments and how kind of your process is in like choosing these objects, because there are so many just objects in our world today to choose from. So when you're looking for like specific objects to perform with, I'm just wondering, to what extent do you kind of like experiment with the objects before? Like, are you looking for a certain thickness of paper? Are you looking for like a certain resonance of the drill that you choose? Or maybe it's more kind of technical, like how the objects work for your purpose?
The answer is honestly a little bit of column A, column B, depending on the piece. A lot of what guided the selection you see today is because it's all from the solo repertoire, and for the most part, reasonably logistically feasible. Not really, but you know, another thing I'll say about some of these pieces is, in the case of echolalia, because you are constantly destroying and breaking everything, you have to rebuy a lot of these items. And so I'll be honest, some of it comes down to like a financial motive, where it's like, I can't afford always, so when I can, I certainly do, but I can't always afford, you know, the best type of paper or the most resonant sounding drill. But that's more so an answer to that piece. I'm certainly thinking about that a lot with maybe the selection of the cactus. This one has, you know, really larger bristles compared to other cacti. The resonance of the rocks, things of that nature. The ice is, you know, certainly a battle between time and what I can do with it. I think if there are other ones. Brake drums too. Brake drums, if they're painted, it modifies the timbre a little bit. And so I don't want to go. And then same too with the bubble wrap. 3 different, you know, sizes of bubbles to get 3 different sort of textures. So it is definitely something I'm conscious of.
Yeah, I guess I'm just thinking like there's a sense that these are found objects, but then you're also kind of creating them, and it's just.
There is a, I'm borrowing this phrase, but I love it so much and I wish I had thought of it. When it comes to found objects, it was, I read it in Jess Sang's paper, but I think she attributes it to Josh, blanking on his name, from So Percussion. And is that these objects are very curatable, but yet easily disposable. And I think that is maybe like a thumbnail sketch of how I'm approaching some of these pieces.
I was wondering how all of your work here with studying found objects and all of the categorization that you've done, how that's transferred back to playing more traditional, typical percussion instruments, and if it's affected your teaching as well.
Certainly has affected my teaching, although with my students we haven't really played any of this literature yet, much to my chagrin. On the one hand, it asks, this research has really asked me to consider, you know, when it is and isn't appropriate to use certain types of like tie gongs, and are there ways of finding like another substitute for that timbre from a less culturally significant object. But as I said in my concluding remarks, you know, I think of the triangle just a bent piece of metal. I guess the real answer to your question is I'm sort of privileging the instruments less. The more traditional instruments like bass drum and timpani and something like that. I don't necessarily say that to my students right away because I don't want to, you know, encourage any sort of lackadaisical behavior. But when we're ready to start having some of these maybe more big brain conversations, then that's when I start to encourage that from them. But at the end of the day, it also comes down to sound quality that can be both objective and subjective, and encouraging the students and myself to find our own musical voice through the process of learning these works, or any work. I mean, I really, this is a late night conversation that could go on for hours and hours, but I don't see that much of a difference between the ice is talking and like a rudimental snare piece. Yeah. Wait, hold on, sorry. Or how are we doing on time? I don't want to make sure. Okay, we got time. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, this is perfect. I was just going to say, it looked like a lot of what you were doing on the front piece, on the ice, is more or less snare technique very often. And so I was sort of curious to hear how you're thinking about how technique specifically, like if you're asked to do something like more traditional like that, where you're not in the cage, if you're thinking of that on your cartoon plane of like, is that like manipulating the sound more because it's sort of not
Different technique, yeah.
it's like a technique, it's artificial technique, but it's like a man-made technique that's on a place.
The short answer is yes, it's absolutely something I am considering. It starts as sort of like what's a sort of generic acceptable baseline knowledge of what most percussionists know and learn and study and what they're asked to do, and then how is that modified through the piece. In the example of the ice piece, I'm constantly asked to sort of change the placement of the tip of the blade or the flat part of the blade on the ice to produce different techniques, and so it's sort of I'm still thinking about it in terms of maybe like the small muscle groups like double stroke rolls and stuff like that, especially also with like the bamboo and the larger muscle groups. Does that answer your question? Yes. Sorry, I'm realizing now I'm not great at answering these questions. Lauren, it's great to see you. Thank you for coming.
Wonderful job.
Thank you.
I was wondering, I might have missed it because I just like the first part, but
Mhm.
like what are you kind of constituting as a found object for the purpose of this project? The one that really stands out to me is the brake drum, just because like in some contexts it's more widely accepted as an instrument.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking like specifically of kind of like steel band. Obviously, like it's pretty much a staple within like the engine room. And then also on that note, would steel pan be a found object in your?
Yeah, steel pan is almost certainly a found object. So I did actually reference the brake drum earlier.
Okay.
Just talking about how it's used as the timbral mimetic aspect of recreating an anvil sound versus just being used by the early percussion works of cowl and cage and sort of evoking other East Asian sound concepts. But also exactly as you said, I referenced the brake drum as the kinetic force of the steel ensemble. And so I'm more or less thinking about objects that were not originally designed for a musical intention, and then the moment that they are utilized or employed in that fashion, then it takes on a broader meaning. But I guess speaking to some of what we were talking about with organology, the classification could still be like this is an idiophone or something because of some of the basic playing techniques still fall under those generic categories. So yeah.
Yeah, or like, do you think that could like change over time? Like, do you think that any of these found objects, if they became used so widely that they were, staples? I guess like I'm not using the right word, but
No, I pose that question too. I said that because the brake drum is more widely used in orchestras and everything than a cactus, does that mean that it's graduated from objecthood into instrumentarium? And I kind of realized that at the current moment, I don't think that's the right question to answer, or the right question that we should be asking. If we're to truly level the playing field, so to speak, and to not create some sort of hierarchy or aristocracy of the timpani and the marimba versus the tin can and the brake drum, then we can't afford to be so segmented with our classification of everything. Yeah. I suppose this model of like manipulation of sound, it extends to other traditional pieces as well. I think of Stuart Saunders Smith's The Noble Snare and the collection of snare pieces, and that every one of those pieces asks performers to think of the snare drum as as an object, and a totally unique instrument and beyond the inherent sound qualities that we're so used to teaching our undergrad students. So by no means is this model, strictly limited to found objects or percussion or anything of that. This has really just been a mental exercise for trying to prevent us from constantly going back and forth and interchangeably using terms like found objects and junk percussion and stuff like that, which I don't think that's changing anytime soon, but I still felt like it was a worthy endeavor.
So we're starting to run out of time.
Great.
I do want to nudge you to talk about one thing you've just hinted at here, but you've talked about more elsewhere over the last 5 years. You hinted at the way in which some of these pieces can help to generate conversations around climate change and environmentalism and those sorts of things. Can you talk more about this repertoire broadly and the way in which, especially you've used that to help have some of those conversations?
Yeah, thank you. I can always count on you to give me the real hard questions at the very end. A lot of my research and a lot of the pieces I'm sort of drawn to naturally are pieces that use objects that have a sort of climate narrative to them. Certainly the first two pieces, or excuse me, the ice and cages piece, have rather overt references, if not easily. You could easily, draw your own conclusions or interpretations from them. But I would say that you could make the same argument with all these other pieces, looking at it perhaps more from like an anti-consumerism or anti-capitalism lens, and so in some ways they're all two sides of the same coin. But there was a second question.
How you've used those pieces to start having some of those conversations, particularly with your non-music specialist audiences. So I'm thinking of the Bertner research in your master's thesis.
The Bertner research, so he's referencing my master's thesis, which was on the music of Matthew Bertner and John Luther Adams, and how their compositional practice changed over time. For those of you that don't know, they both spent large portions of their lives living in Alaska. And while they no longer live in Alaska, they're largely influenced by climate change, and it's dramatically shaped the style of compositions from pieces that more or less sort of celebrate and showcase, here are all the wonderful natural sounds of the world, or in the case of Vivian Funk's piece, showing us on a really accelerated level that the human manipulation is a very real, significant, dramatic consequence of how we treat the natural world. And Matthew Bertner has also written a number of pieces like this for, playing on amplified snow and glockenspiel. And he'll use almost every piece has some sort of granular synthesized backing track to go along with it. And what he often does with this granular synthesis is he'll take data from climate sources and sonify, or in other words, turn these sort of numbers into a musical sound, and that then provides the backing track for some of these pieces. One piece that comes to mind is Ice Prince for piano, where he sort of takes the levels of ice decay in a certain portion of Alaska and sort of turns that into a tape while the pianist starts at the very beginning from the very highest register of the instrument, and by the end of the piece they're playing in the lowest register of the piece. I'm sure we're about, sorry, I didn't mean to vamp there.
No, that's great. We are out of time,
yeah.
So let's thank Luke, and please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.